On the bench today I have a pair of Edifier R980T active loudspeakers. Now, I've previously reviewed another pair of Edifier speakers. I've had an amazing number of views for it. I'll put a link on there, so if you haven't seen it, have a look. This particular speaker's claim to fame is, how the hell can you make an active loudspeaker for about $60 New Zealand a pair? This is the main reason I picked up these speakers. I've paid for them with my own money. I'm not sponsored by Edifier. In fact, Edifier will probably wish I hadn't reviewed them, but that's another thing altogether. Let's start by talking about who this speaker is aimed at. Now, I mentioned previously that they cost an amazingly low amount of money, 60 odd New Zealand dollars. Now, for that you get a pair of speakers with built-in amplifiers. They actually are rated at 15 to 20 watts, but I've measured them and they typically put out about 10 watts. But that's really because of the way I rate an amplifier. Most people in this game tend to rate them at 10% distortion, and it probably would give 20 watts at 10% distortion, but that is horribly distorted. I like to give you true useful power, and that is about 10 watts. For that you get just under 0.4% distortion. Now, that is, of course, the amplifier distortion. Now, for the same amount of money, you can buy so-called computer speakers, which are usually a single drive unit of about 3 or 4 inches with a 2 to 3 watt amplifier built in, and they're made of plastic. And I wouldn't even insult your intelligence to suggest that these are anything other than total rubbish. And I've cleaned that up a bit. That's not the first word that comes to mind. But I was going to say you get what you pay for, but I don't think that's true. You get a lot for what you pay for these. And that's why I've chosen to review them, because normally I wouldn't bother with speakers of that kind of price, because the price tells you they're going to be junk. I mean, I'm an engineer by trade, and I've been around hi-fi and speakers all my life. And if someone came to me and said, make a loudspeaker that costs $60, I would have said, don't be silly. The box would cost more than that. And that's true. So when you consider $60, that's delivered, in my case, from Australia to New Zealand, free. There's 15% tax on that, and there's the margin that the manufacturers have made. So I just don't know how you can make a loudspeaker for that kind of money. So if you're looking for a reasonably okay pair of speakers to run with your computer, this is it. This is it. I don't think you'll find better. But in terms of a hi-fi speaker, I mean, the price tells you it's not going to be hi-fi. Not from any stretch of the imagination. In fact, straight out of the box, they sound pretty, choosing my words carefully, not very good. They are excessively bright and trebly and very boomy bass-wise. But all is not lost. I've done some messing about with some EQ. Now, before we go there, let me tell you how these speakers are made and sort of what makes them tick. Now, to me, If you have a small drive unit, i.e. 3 or 4 inches, science tells you you are not going to get down to 50 or 60 hertz in frequency. It's just impossible. You might be able to do it in a transmission line, but we're not talking about a transmission line here. We're talking about a box that has no bracing, and when you tap the side of it, it rings like hell. It really rings, and you can hear the ring in listening tests. But I have to keep saying this, $60, not a lot of money. What they do to try and make the sound better is to boost the treble and the bass. So if you're expecting a flat frequency response from these, you're not going to get it. It's not flat. There is excessive bass lift on it, and that means when you turn the volume up, and they do get quite loud, I have to say that they do get quite loud, even though they've only got it at 10 watts or so. Let's have a look at the amplifier. The first thing we need to know is that this is a Class D amplifier running on approximately 18 volts. Now the power supply is located at the bottom of the cabinet. There's no point in me showing you that because it's just an encapsulated black box. But the power comes up into, this is the main module. This is the main amplifier, which is a Texas Instruments TAS 5707. Now that's quite a clever chip, apart from the fact it delivers about 10 watts per channel of relatively clean power. It also has extensive EQ and protection built into it. Now, to me, that's one of the downsides of this particular chip, because most Edifier low-cost speakers, I can't speak about the more expensive ones because I've never tested them, but they all use very extensive EQ, which in my opinion messes up the sound, but that's just my opinion. This chip here is a processor, is in fact an analog to digital converter, because obviously some parts of the circuitry seem to work in the digital domain. This chip here I can't identify. These black parts here are chokes, and they are what effectively is in line with the loudspeaker to remove the high frequency carrier from the Class D amplifier. This is the bass stroke mid-range unit, and it's basically a paper cone with a metallized sort of paint, for want of a better word, small dust cover and a rubber surround. Quite a reasonable magnet. In fact, there's 2 magnets on there. Not a bad driver considering the low cost of the speaker. Removing the bass mid-range unit, you can see inside, and what you can in fact see, hard to light because I'm having to shine a torch in there, but that is the switch mode power supply, which is actually mounted on the bottom of the cabinet. Also inside the speaker is this minute piece of baff wadding, which is almost completely useless, but that was fitted around here inside the speaker. I've removed the 4 screws from the tweeter, and we're going to lift it out now and have a look what's inside. I suspect probably not a lot. Well, I'm not really surprised to find there is no crossover in the loudspeaker. All the signals go straight to the bass mid-range unit, and another feed comes off to the tweeter via this capacitor. and that is a 3.3 microfarad 50 volts, and is an electrolytic, but it's what is known as a non-polarized one. What that basically means is it's designed to work off AC, which of course is what the signal is. Now let's have a look at the back of the cabinet and discuss some of the things on it. This is where you connect your other pair of the speakers. These are the inputs, and there's two separate inputs. Now you can't use these both at the same time, and I suppose I would say, why would you want to? There's an on-off power switch here, and you have a volume control here. Now the only tone control is this one here marked bass. Now it is marked plus and minus from the center point, but that's not true. It's flat roughly when you've got it fully to minus, and whatever you do, don't use it above naught. When you go on to plus bass, you're just going to get lots of bass distortion and overloading the drive unit, and it will sound dreadful. Just don't do that. When I talk about EQ later, I'm talking about it with this set in the 0 position here. So we're not boosting nor cutting. So that's something you must bear in mind. Now the inputs are different sensitivities. The one marked PC, which is this one, has a sensitivity of 700 millivolts to get maximum power, and the auxiliary input has an input sensitivity of 550 millivolts. Now I would suggest that you always use the auxiliary, because 700 millivolts for this input, even though it says PC, you might as well call it an elephant, and this one you can call a sheep, because it has no direct meaning in what you connect to it. I would suggest that you always use the auxiliary input. All it means is that you will drive it easier on most inputs. One thing that you may find is it's not sensitive enough. Now, when I tried it with my telephone, which is a Galaxy 10, Samsung Galaxy 10, which is sort of middle of the road phone. Most phones give out about the same output. I found that the output of the phone had to be full, and you could never reach maximum power with this volume control. There simply wasn't enough coming out of the telephone. When you run it from the computer, there's more than enough power, and I suggest possibly a laptop or tablet could be very similar. I started talking about the fact these have a lot of processing in the sound to try and make it an attractive sound, and it sort of works, but as it stands, these have far too much bass for the size of the box. And I know that sounds ridiculous to say they've got too much bass, but it sounds better when you reduce the bass. The problem with the bass it has, it's all one note bass. It's basically the resonance frequency of the box, and you can really hear that in the bass. It's about 150 hertz, and there is a huge bump in the frequency response at that point, and it gives rise to the term one note bass, because you get that huge rise and then it drops off like a brick. There is no output at 50 or 60 hertz, and if you can force it to sort of go down there, but the cone is literally flapping about and the distortion is about 30%. I know that doesn't mean a lot to most people, but if the cone is not controlled going in and out like this, it just sort of flops about, and that's what gives rise to the distortion and the dreadful bass. But if you limit its bass response within the realms of the size of the cabinet and the size of the driver, you could make it sound reasonably pleasant. Now, on the back of the cabinet there is one tone control, and you can't alter the treble at all, and it's up. And when I first tried these and I just played it with a flat response going into it, the treble just cuts you like a knife. It really screeches and sounds awful because you can't control it. It's got lift on it and that's it. You just accept it, and all the tone control does, it makes the already high bass output even more. And if you turn the bass on to full, that poor little bass unit almost jumps out of the box. And I don't mean that to sound impressive, it sounds horrible because you're forcing it to do something it was not designed for. But don't go away and think, oh no, I don't want those, he's put me off it. You can alter the EQ and make it sound. You can't alter the EQ in the box, but if you're going to be playing this through your telephone, most telephones have variable EQ, which when you plug that into or listen to it from its internal speaker, it makes virtually no difference. But if you connect it via a cable, you've got a limited but reasonable graphic EQ in there, which you can use to make it sound good. If you're using the computer and you're using a program like VLC, it has quite good EQ possibilities. Now, in a high quality speaker, you can EQ the speaker often, I won't say always, but often, and make a reasonably good response. You can't do it with these. You can't get rid of the huge peaks in the response, which is basically resonance within the cabinet, and the bass unit goes up too high, because normally in a two-way speaker you would have the bass unit playing up until about 3 kilohertz, and then it would roll off because of the crossover, because you don't want high frequencies going into the bass unit, because you get what's called cone breakup, where the cone, we won't go too far into that because you start getting maths involved and all sorts of stuff, which I'm sure you don't want to hear. And then the tweeter, you don't want bass going into the tweeter because it will quickly destroy it. It'll just burn the coil out. So that's what that little capacitor is. But that rolls off the bass at 6 decibels, 6 dB per octave, which is quite a slow slope. Whereas with a proper crossover, it would roll off quickly. And so you only get high frequencies going into the tweeter. But in this arrangement, all frequencies are thrown at the bass unit, and it relies on the fact that it will naturally, gradually roll off. Before I finish the video, I'm going to play you a piece of music from the YouTube library, and it will be using the EQ that I'm suggesting here. This particular EQ came from my computer and of the program VLC, which makes the whole sound of the speaker somewhat better. Nowhere near perfect, but in the follow-up video, which I'm already working on, I'm going to give you a circuit for a proper crossover that you can put inside this speaker depending on your abilities, but I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible. Now, it will never transfer this transform, I should say, this speaker into a $3,000 speaker. It's always going to be what it is, but we can make it a little bit better using more components in the crossover. Enjoy the music.